Every satisfying downfall begins the same way. A man stands at the height of his power, untouchable, immovable, carved from the same cold stone as the fortress he commands. He surveys his domain and mistakes silence for loyalty, fear for respect, and isolation for strength. Duke Caedric Ravenshade was that man. And the story of how one woman dismantled him from the inside without ever raising her voice against him is the kind of ruin worth witnessing from the very first crack to the final collapse. Stay close. This one bleeds slow. The cathedral smelled of wet granite and dead lilies. Caedric stood at the altar with his hands clasped behind his back, shoulders squared beneath a coat of black velvet trimmed with silver thread that caught the candlelight like a blade's edge. 200 guests filled the pews behind him, nobles, ministers, lords of minor houses who owed Valemere their survival and resented every breath they drew because of it. He could feel their eyes boring into the space between his shoulder blades. Some of them had placed wagers on whether the bride would arrive at all. Others had placed wagers on whether the Duke would speak his vows or simply sign the contract and walk out. He intended to do both. The massive oak doors groaned open and rain swept in from the courtyard, spattering the flagstones with cold. A figure emerged from the gray downpour. Seraphina Vale moved through the entrance without hesitation, her gown trailing dark where the rain had soaked the hem, silver embroidery catching what little light existed in the dim nave. She walked alone. No father to offer her arm, no attendants fussing at her train, just a woman crossing a threshold into a future she had not chosen, carrying herself as though she had chosen it anyway. Caedric did not turn around. He listened to the rhythm of her footsteps on the stone floor. Measured, unhurried. The guests shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A child whimpered and was silenced. And still those footsteps came, steady as a metronome, until they stopped beside him and the faint scent of rain-soaked lavender replaced the dead air. The officiant began speaking. Caedric stared straight ahead at the wall behind the altar, where centuries of Ravenshade names had been chiseled into black marble. His father, his grandfather, his great-uncle who had burned 3 rival estates to the ground and called it diplomacy. Every name a monument to the doctrine that had governed his bloodline for generations. Power first, power always. Everything else was decoration. Do you, Duke Caedric Aldrich Ravenshade, take this woman as your lawful wife? I do. 2 words, no inflection. He might as well have been confirming a grain shipment. And do you, Lady Seraphina Eloise Vale, take this man as your lawful husband? A pause. Barely a heartbeat, but enough for Caedric to register it. He still did not look at her. I do. Her voice was low and clear, steadier than he expected from a woman whose family name had become synonymous with disgrace. He filed that observation away the same way he filed intelligence reports from his border garrisons. Potentially useful, probably irrelevant. They signed the marriage contract at a table dragged to the side of the altar, 2 copies. His pen moved first. Hers followed without trembling. When it was done, Caedric turned and walked back down the nave without offering his arm, without a word, without acknowledging that anything of significance had occurred beyond the transfer of assets that would keep Valemere solvent through winter. Behind him, Seraphina stood alone at the altar for 3 full seconds before she followed. The wedding feast was a performance of hostility dressed in crystal and candlelight. Blackthorn Keep's great hall had been arranged for the occasion, long tables draped in dark linen, silver platters heaped with roasted pheasant, braised venison, winter root vegetables glazed in honey and thyme. Wine flowed from decanters that cost more than a village family earned in a year. The chandeliers above threw fractured light across the faces of 200 aristocrats who had come not to celebrate but to measure. Caedric sat at the head table on a chair that functioned as a throne in everything but name. Seraphina occupied the seat beside him. They had not spoken since the ceremony. Between them lay 12 inches of tablecloth and a silence that had weight. Duchess Margaret of Thornwall leaned across the table, her emerald necklace swinging above her plate. She was 60, sharp-featured, and had survived 4 political purges by being more vicious than every man who tried to remove her. "My dear Seraphina, what a charming gown! Is that the Vale family silver, or did you have to borrow it?" The table within earshot went quiet. Seraphina lifted her wine glass. The embroidery was my mother's. She designed it the year before she died. I find it holds up remarkably well under scrutiny. Margaret's smile thinned. How sentimental. How observant of you to notice. Caedric caught the exchange without turning his head. He reached for his own glass and drank. The wine tasted like iron and oak. He set it down and addressed the minister seated to his left. Hargrove, the northern supply routes. I want a full report by morning. Minister Hargrove, a portly man whose loyalties shifted with the direction of political wind, nodded rapidly. Of course, Your Grace, though I should mention there has been some difficulty with the by morning. Yes, Your Grace. Conversation resumed around them in careful, controlled tones. Laughter that never quite reached genuine. Compliments laced with enough acid to dissolve trust. Caedric monitored all of it the way a general monitors a battlefield from an elevated position. He cataloged who spoke to whom, who avoided eye contact, who drank too much and whose hands shook when they raised their glasses. This was not a celebration. This was reconnaissance. Halfway through the second course, Lord Pemberton approached the head table with the kind of swagger that only inherited wealth and minimal intelligence could produce. He bowed to Caedric, then turned his attention entirely to Seraphina. My Lady Duchess, Valemere is fortunate indeed. Tell me, does it feel strange to carry a title your family spent decades trying to destroy? The insult landed in open air. Several guests pretended not to hear. Several more leaned in. Seraphina set down her fork. Lord Pemberton, I was not aware you had interest in history. I thought your expertise was limited to losing money at cards and blaming it on your steward. Pemberton's face reddened. You merely wanted to see if the new Duchess bleeds when cut. Seraphina met his gaze without blinking. I do, but I also remember who held the knife. Pemberton retreated with a stiff bow and a jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Caedric watched him go. Then he looked at Seraphina for the first time since the altar. She had already returned to her plate, cutting a piece of venison with surgical precision, her expression betraying nothing. He studied her profile, the line of her jaw, the controlled stillness of her hands, the way she occupied the chair beside him as though she had measured its exact dimensions before sitting down and decided it would hold her. Something shifted behind his ribs. Not admiration, nothing so clean. More like the instinct a predator develops when it realizes the creature beside it has teeth of its own. He looked away and did not speak to her for the rest of the evening. The first month of their marriage established the architecture of distance. Caedric rose before dawn. He took his breakfast alone in the study that overlooked the eastern cliffs. He spent mornings in council with his ministers, afternoons reviewing military dispatches, evenings receiving petitioners in the stone hall where his ancestors had passed judgment for 3 centuries. His days were regimented to the minute. There was no room in them for a wife, and he had designed it that way. Seraphina occupied the west wing. She was given quarters befitting her title and nothing else. No involvement in household decisions, no seat at council meetings, no acknowledgement beyond the perfunctory nod Caedric offered when they crossed paths in the corridors, which happened rarely because he had memorized her schedule and adjusted his routes to avoid intersection. He told himself this was efficiency. The truth was closer to cowardice, but Caedric Ravenshade had never once in his life applied that word to himself, and he was not about to start now. The court, however, was less restrained. She wanders the gardens at odd hours, Duchess Margaret reported to a circle of noble wives during their weekly salon, speaking loudly enough that the words would carry. Alone, without escort. One would think she was raised among merchants, not aristocrats. Her father was a traitor, Lady Ashford added, selecting a pastry from a silver tray. Blood tells, Margaret. Blood always tells. Has the Duke even visited her chambers? Silence. Then quiet laughter, the kind that carried poison in its undertones. Seraphina heard every word. She was standing in the corridor outside the salon, having paused on her way to the library. She did not enter the room. She did not confront them. She listened with the same disciplined stillness she had cultivated since the age of 14, when she first understood that the world would always punish her for a crime her father may or may not have committed. and that protest was merely an invitation for more punishment. She turned and walked to the library instead. The books in Blackthorn Keep's collection spanned centuries: agricultural records, trade agreements, military histories. Seraphina pulled volume after volume from the shelves and spread them across a reading table near the window where the northern light was strongest. She was not reading for pleasure. She was mapping Valemere's infrastructure, its revenue streams, its points of failure, the pattern of debt and decline that had driven Caedric to accept a marriage he clearly despised. By the end of the second week, she understood his duchy better than most of his ministers. By the end of the third, she understood exactly how to save it. The question was whether she wanted to save anything belonging to a man who treated her like a line item in a ledger. She closed the last volume and stared out the window at the frozen coastline below. Waves hammered the black cliffs in rhythmic violence. Somewhere beyond that gray horizon lay the remnants of her old life. A name in ruins. A fortune stripped and redistributed among the very nobles who had framed her father. A childhood home sold at auction to pay debts that were never legitimately owed. Seraphina pressed her fingertips against the cold glass. There was a version of this story where she did nothing, where she occupied her rooms and wore her title like a costume and let Valemere eat itself alive from the inside while she watched from the window. That version was easier, safer. It asked nothing of her except patience and spite. But spite was a luxury for people who had never watched a village starve, and patience, she had learned, was just another word for complicity when someone had the power to act and chose not to. She began making plans that night. 6 weeks after the wedding, Caedric summoned his brother. Lord Lucian Ravenshade arrived at Blackthorn Keep on a Tuesday afternoon, riding through the main gates on a chestnut mare with his coat unbuttoned and his hair still damp from travel. Where Caedric was iron and sharp angles, Lucien was warmth poured into a frame that moved through the world as though it owed him a good time. He dismounted in the courtyard, tossed his reins to a groom, and stretched his arms toward the gray sky. God, this place is still depressing. Caedric met him in the entrance hall. The brothers had not seen each other in 14 months. Lucien crossed the marble floor in 3 strides and clasped Caedric by the shoulders. "You look terrible," Lucien said with a grin. "Marriage agrees with you exactly the way I predicted. I did not summon you for personal commentary. No, you summoned me because the Mortain situation is worse than you are willing to admit to your ministers, and you need someone you can actually talk to without calculating their loyalty coefficient." Lucien dropped his hands and shrugged. "I read between the lines of your very formal, very terse letter." Caedric's jaw tightened. "The Mortains have secured 3 new alliances in the southern corridor. They are pressuring Parliament to review the Valemere Charter. If they succeed, they carve your duchy into pieces and distribute it like party favors." "Yes, I understand political annihilation. I am, despite your persistent belief otherwise, not an idiot." "Then you understand why I need you here." Lucien studied his brother's face, the deep lines around his eyes, the tension riding his shoulders like a yoke, the controlled fury that Caedric wore the way other men wore cologne. Something else, too. Something Lucien could not immediately identify, but filed away for later examination. "I'll stay," Lucien said. "But I want to meet your wife first." "Why?" "Because you married her, and have apparently told no one a single meaningful thing about her, which means either she is spectacularly boring or you are spectacularly afraid of what she represents. And I have met boring women, brother. They do not typically provoke the level of avoidance you are demonstrating." Caedric said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward his study. "Dinner is at 7. Do not be late." That evening changed the geometry of Blackthorn Keep. Dinner was served in the small dining hall, a room that seated 12 but felt intimate enough to expose every silence. Caedric occupied the head of the table. Seraphina sat to his right. Lucien was placed to his left, and the remaining seats were filled with senior ministers and their wives. Lucien spent the first course studying Seraphina with undisguised curiosity. She ate with the practiced elegance of someone trained to perform composure under observation. Her responses to the ministers' wives were precise and measured. She deflected personal questions with the skill of a diplomat and redirected conversations toward topics that exposed the speaker's vanity without them realizing they had been maneuvered. Lucien was fascinated. "Tell me, Lady Duchess," he said during a lull, leaning forward with both elbows on the table in deliberate violation of protocol. "What do you do with yourself in this fortress of joy? My brother is not exactly known for his hospitality." Seraphina glanced at Caedric, whose expression had not changed from its default state of controlled severity. "I read," she said. "You read." "Extensively." "About what?" "Whatever the library provides. Your family was remarkably thorough in documenting its own history. 3 centuries of Ravenshade ambition, all bound in leather and shelved alphabetically." Lucien laughed. It was a genuine sound, warm and unguarded, and it rang through the small dining hall like a bell struck in a church. Several of the minister's wives looked up. Minister Hargrove spilled wine on his cuff. "She's funny," Lucien said, turning to Caedric. "Did you know she was funny?" Caedric cut a piece of roast lamb. "I was not aware humor was a qualification for the position." "The position," Lucien repeated, his smile fading just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Is that what we are calling it now?" The table went quiet. Caedric set down his knife and fork with the deliberate precision of a man choosing not to throw them. "Lucien, I apologize." Lucien raised his glass toward Seraphina. "To the Duchess of Valemere, may her stay in this miserable pile of stone be less soul-crushing than it appears from the outside." Seraphina raised her glass in return. Something passed between them. Not flirtation, not alliance. Something closer to mutual recognition. 2 people who had learned to read the spaces between words because the words themselves were never safe. Caedric watched the exchange with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. After dinner, he retired to his study and poured whiskey from a crystal decanter. He stood at the window overlooking the courtyard where snow had begun to fall in heavy, silent curtains. Below, a single light burned in the west wing. Her light. He drank and told himself the tightness in his chest was indigestion. 3 days later, Lucien found Seraphina in the library. She was buried in a stack of agricultural records dating back 40 years, her hair pinned loosely, ink stains on her fingers. Lucien dropped into the chair across from her and kicked his boots up on the table. "So you're not just reading for entertainment?" Seraphina did not look up. "I was not aware I was being monitored." "You are the most interesting person in this castle by a margin so wide it qualifies as a canyon. Of course you are being monitored." She turned a page. "Your brother would disagree." "My brother is an exceptional strategist and an absolute catastrophe at everything that requires acknowledging another human being as more than a chess piece." Lucien picked up a loose document from the table and scanned it. "These are crop yield reports from the eastern villages. Why are you reading crop yield reports?" "Because someone should." The ministers have been falsifying harvest data for at least 3 years, possibly longer. The numbers they report to your brother do not match the numbers recorded at the village level. The discrepancy is consistent and directional, always inflated, always by roughly the same margin. Lucien lowered the document. His expression shifted from casual amusement to something sharper, more focused. "You are telling me the ministers are lying to Caedric about food supplies. I am telling you that Valemere's eastern villages are likely producing 30% less grain than the official reports suggest, which means either the surplus is being diverted somewhere your brother cannot see it, or the land is failing and no one wants to be the one to deliver that news. And you figured this out from library books." "I figured this out from library books, estate ledgers, and a functioning understanding of arithmetic." She finally looked up. "Your brother is fighting political wars in Parliament while his people are quietly starving. He does not know because the men he trusts are either incompetent or corrupt, and no one in this castle is willing to tell him the truth." "Including you?" Seraphina held his gaze. "He did not marry me for my opinions, Lord Ravenshade. He married me for my money. I am under no illusion about my function here." "Then why do you care?" The question hung in the air between them. Snow fell past the window. The fire crackled in the grate. Somewhere in the castle, a door slammed. "Because the people in those villages did not choose this," Seraphina said. "They did not choose a duke who cannot see past his own walls. They did not choose ministers who cook the books. They did not choose to starve because powerful men are too proud or too distracted to look at the actual numbers." She closed the ledger in front of her. I may not have chosen to be here either, but I am here. And I can count. Lucian stared at her for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. My brother has no idea what he married. Your brother has no idea about a great many things. I'm going to help you. I did not ask for help. No, you did not. That is precisely why I am offering it. Their alliance formed in that library, between dusty ledgers and dying firelight. No oaths sworn. No dramatic declarations. Just two people recognizing that the machinery around them was broken and deciding, independently but simultaneously, that watching it grind itself apart was not something either of them could stomach. They agreed on terms. Lucienne would provide political cover and access to intelligence networks Seraphina could not reach as an outsider. Seraphina would provide the analysis, the planning, and the ground-level execution. Neither of them would tell Caedric. Not yet. Not until they had enough evidence to force him to see what he had been refusing to look at. It was practical. It was necessary. And it was the single most dangerous thing either of them could have done inside Blackthorn Keep, because Caedric Ravenshade did not tolerate secrets, not in his court, not in his council, and certainly not between his wife and his brother. And when he discovered what they were building behind his back, the ruthless Duke of Valemere would not respond with curiosity. He would respond with the only language he had ever trusted: destruction. 2 weeks later, Caedric returned from a late council session to find the corridor outside his study occupied. His personal steward, Aldrich Voss, stood against the wall with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting long enough to rehearse his opening line several times and was now terrified of delivering it. "Speak," Caedric said without breaking stride. Voss fell into step beside him. "Your Grace, I would not normally bring domestic matters to your attention. Then do not. But there is a situation that may require your awareness." Voss swallowed. "Lady Seraphina has been receiving correspondence regularly. The letters arrive through the village post, not through the castle courier system, and they are addressed using an assumed name." Caedric stopped walking. The corridor was empty. Torchlight threw long shadows across the stone walls. Outside, wind howled against the windows like something alive and furious trying to get inside. "How long?" "At least 3 weeks, Your Grace, possibly longer. The kitchen staff noticed because the deliveries coincide with the supply runs from Eldermere." "And the content of these letters?" "Unknown. She keeps them in the locked drawer of her writing desk. I did not presume to—" "You did not presume." Caedric turned to face Voss fully. His voice had not risen. It had in fact dropped to the register that every servant in Blackthorn Keep had learned to fear more than shouting. "You are telling me that my wife has been conducting a secret correspondence under a false identity from inside my own castle, and your response was to not presume." Voss looked like a man standing on a frozen lake who had just heard the first crack. "Find out who she is writing to, find out what those letters contain, and find out whether my brother is involved. Your Grace, Lord Lucian, has been spending a conspicuous amount of time in the library with my wife. I may be occupied, Voss, but I am not blind." Caedric stepped closer. "I built this duchy on the principle that loyalty is the only currency that matters. If I discover that the two people living under my roof have decided to trade in a different one, there will be consequences that neither of them will recover from." He turned and walked into his study, closing the door behind him with a sound that was quieter and far more violent than a slam. Inside, he poured whiskey and did not drink it. He stood at the window and stared at the west wing, where a single lamp still burned in her chambers. The woman he had dismissed, the brother he had trusted, and a secret growing between them in the dark. Caedric Ravenshade had survived betrayals that would have buried lesser men. He had weathered political assassinations, economic sabotage, and the systematic destruction of alliances he spent years constructing. None of it had touched him. None of it had reached the place inside him where something human still flickered, small and starved and surrounded by walls he had spent a lifetime building. But this felt different. This felt like the foundation cracking beneath a structure he had convinced himself was unbreakable. He gripped the glass until the crystal cut into his palm. A thin line of blood traced down his wrist and dripped onto the stone floor. He did not notice. He was already calculating. Caedric did not sleep that night. He He sat in the leather chair behind his desk with the untouched whiskey bleeding amber light from the crystal and the dried blood on his palm cracking every time he flexed his fingers. The fire in the grate had collapsed to embers by the time the first gray light crawled over the eastern cliffs, and still he had not moved. His mind worked the way it always worked when threatened, methodically, without sentiment, stripping every interaction of the past 6 weeks down to its skeleton and examining the bones for fractures he should have caught weeks ago. Lucienne in the library. The sound of Seraphina's laughter drifting through a door left slightly open. His brother's boots propped on a reading table that had belonged to their father. The way Lucienne said her name without the formality Caedric had never once dropped. The way she looked at Lucienne when she thought no one was watching, not with desire but with something worse. Trust. Caedric pressed his thumb into the cut on his palm until the pain sharpened his focus. Trust was the one thing she had never offered him. Not at the altar, not at the wedding feast, not in the 6 weeks of cohabitation that had produced less conversation than a trade negotiation with hostile merchants. She had given him silence and compliance, and the careful performance of a woman who understood her contractual obligations. And he had accepted it because silence and compliance were all he had ever required from the people around him. But she had given Lucienne something else entirely, something voluntary. The question was whether that something was personal or strategic, and the answer to that question would determine whether Caedric dismantled 2 people or an entire conspiracy. He stood, washed the blood from his hand in the basin near the window, buttoned his coat, and went to find Aldrich Voss. The steward was waiting in the servants' corridor below the kitchens, which told Caedric that Voss had anticipated being summoned and positioned himself accordingly. Useful instinct, the kind that kept men alive in Blackthorn Keep. "The letters," Caedric said. Voss produced a folded sheet of paper from inside his waistcoat. "I was unable to access the locked drawer, Your Grace. However, I intercepted the most recent delivery before it reached the Duchess. It arrived this morning with the Eldermere supply cart, addressed to a Mrs. Ashton Gray." Caedric took the letter. The paper was cheap, the handwriting was careful and unpracticed, the kind produced by someone who had learned to write late in life. He opened it and read. The letter was from a woman named Maren Holt. She identified herself as the wife of a tenant farmer in the village of Briarfield, 12 miles east of Blackthorn Keep. The contents were not romantic. They were not political. They were a detailed account of conditions in Briarfield, crop failures, livestock disease, 3 families who had abandoned their homes in the past month because there was nothing left to eat, a request for additional seed grain and medical supplies, referencing a previous shipment that had arrived 2 weeks earlier and saved, in Maren Holt's words, at least 4 children from starvation. The letter ended with a single line that Caedric read 3 times. "We call you the Silver Lady because you come when no one else will." He folded the letter along its original creases. His expression did not change, his breathing did not alter. But something behind his sternum shifted with a sound only he could hear, like a door being forced open in a room that had been sealed for years. "Your Grace?" Voss said carefully. "How many villages has she contacted?" "I am uncertain. The kitchen staff mentioned at least 3 separate delivery points, Briarfield, Eldermere, and a hamlet called Thornbrook that I confess I cannot locate on any current map. It is not on current maps. It was removed from the official registry 8 years ago when the population dropped below taxable threshold." Caedric looked at the letter again. "She found a village that my own cartographers erased." Voss waited. He had served the Duke long enough to recognize the quality of silence that preceded decisions. This was not the cold, rapid calculation that preceded punishment. This was something else, something he had never witnessed in 15 years of service. Caedric was uncertain. "Leave me," the Duke said. "Your Grace, regarding Lord Lucien's involvement—" "I said leave me." Voss vanished. Caedric stood alone in the servants' corridor with a farmer's wife's letter in his hand, and the first genuine confusion he had experienced since the age of 19, when his father died and left him a duchy drowning in debt and surrounded by enemies who smelled blood the way sharks smell it, from miles away and with absolute certainty about what comes next. He had built his entire identity on the premise that he understood power better than anyone alive, that he could read a situation the way a surgeon reads an X-ray, seeing the hidden structures beneath the surface and knowing exactly where to cut. His wife had been operating a covert relief network under his roof for weeks, and he had not seen it, had not even suspected it, because he had decided on their wedding day that she was nothing more than a financial transaction, and he had never revisited that assessment. The question now was not what Seraphina was doing. The letter made that brutally clear. The question was what it meant that she had done it without him, without asking, without waiting for permission or recognition or any of the things that every other person in his life demanded before they lifted a finger. She had simply seen a wound and started stitching. And she had done it in secret because she understood correctly that he would have stopped her. That realization sat in his chest like a coal that would not cool. He pocketed the letter and climbed the stairs toward the west wing. Seraphina was not in her chambers. He found her in the kitchen garden behind the castle's south wall, kneeling in frozen dirt with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and a basket of dried lavender cuttings beside her. The sky above was the color of iron. Wind pulled at her hair, which she had pinned carelessly, strands escaping across her face. Her fingers were red from cold. She did not look up when he approached. She had heard him coming. She always heard him coming. His footsteps had a particular weight to them, a deliberateness that announced authority before he entered any room, and she had learned to identify them within the first week of living in his castle. "Your Grace," she said, continuing to work the soil around a dormant rosemary plant. "You do not typically visit this part of the grounds. I do not typically discover that my wife is running a shadow operation across my duchy." Her hand stopped. Caedric watched the stillness move through her body, the way her shoulders tightened, the way her fingers curled slowly into the dirt. She was not frightened. He could see that immediately. She was recalculating, adjusting. The same thing he did when an opponent made an unexpected move, except she did it with a physical control that he found, against every instinct, remarkable. She stood, brushed the soil from her hands, turned to face him. "How much do you know?" "Enough. The question is how much you are willing to tell me without being interrogated, and how much of what you tell me will be the truth." Seraphina studied him. The gray light fell across the sharp planes of his face, emphasizing the tension in his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a night spent without rest. He was furious. She could see that, but the fury was layered over something else, something she had not seen in him before and could not immediately classify. "I have been sending supplies to villages in the eastern corridor," she said. "Food, seed grain, medical provisions, blankets, basic materials for structural repair." "With what resources?" "My own. Your dowry was transferred to the Valemere treasury upon our marriage. You have no independent resources. I have resources you did not inventory because you did not consider them worth inventorying. Jewelry, personal items with trade value. A small fund held in trust by my mother's family that was not included in the marriage contract because no one thought to ask about it, and I did not volunteer the information." Caedric's eyes narrowed. "You withheld assets." "I preserved options. There is a difference, though I suspect the distinction is lost on a man who considers his wife's jewelry a line item in a financial statement." The wind picked up, lavender cuttings scattered across the frozen ground between them. Neither moved to collect them. "How many villages?" "7. 7. He repeated the number as though testing its weight. "You have been supplying 7 villages without the knowledge or authorization of the ducal administration. Without the knowledge or authorization of an administration that has been falsifying harvest reports for 3 years, yes." Seraphina's voice hardened. "Your ministers are lying to you, Caedric. The eastern corridor is collapsing. Families are abandoning land that their grandparents farmed. Children are going hungry in a duchy that should be producing surplus grain, and the reason it is not producing surplus grain is because someone in your council is either stealing it or covering up the failure, and nobody is willing to tell you because everyone in this castle is terrified of what happens when you hear something you do not want to hear." The use of his first name landed between them like a stone thrown into still water. She had never called him Caedric, not once. Not at the altar, not at the wedding feast, not in any of the handful of interactions they had shared over 6 weeks of living under the same roof. He felt the impact of it in his sternum, physical, disorienting. "And Lucien," he said, his voice dropping to the register that preceded violence. "What is my brother's role in this?" Seraphina did not flinch. "Lucien provided access to courier routes I could not reach on my own. He verified information I gathered from the estate records, and he agreed to keep the operation confidential until we had sufficient evidence to present to you." "To present to me? You were not ready to hear it. That was not your determination to make." "No? Then whose was it? Yours? The man who has not spoken more than 40 words to me since our wedding? The man who rearranges his schedule to avoid crossing my path in his own corridors?" She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the dirt beneath her fingernails and the flush that cold and anger had painted across her cheekbones. "You made it very clear from the first day that I was not welcome at your table, in your council, or in any part of your life that mattered. So I found parts that you neglected, and I filled them. And if that feels like a betrayal to you, I suggest you consider what it felt like to be locked inside this castle for 6 weeks with a husband who could not be bothered to learn my middle name." Caedric stared at her. The wind screamed across the garden wall. The sky pressed down like a lid. And somewhere inside the architecture of his certainty, a load-bearing wall developed a crack that no amount of fury or calculation could repair. Because she was right. Not about everything. Not about the method. The secrecy was a violation that his pride would not easily absorb, and the involvement of his brother added a dimension of betrayal that he was not yet prepared to examine without breaking something. But the core of it, the substance beneath the strategy. She was right. He had ignored his own duchy because he was too consumed with the enemies outside the walls to see the rot inside them. He had delegated trust to ministers who had earned it through longevity rather than competence, and he had punished anyone who brought him bad news until no one brought him anything but comfortable lies. He had built a fortress so impenetrable that the truth itself could not get in. And the woman he married for her money had climbed over the wall while he was not looking and shown him what his kingdom actually looked like. He should have been grateful. Instead, he felt something far more dangerous than gratitude. He felt exposed, stripped of the narrative that had sustained him for a decade, the narrative that said he was the only one capable of seeing clearly, the only one strong enough to make the hard decisions, the only person in Valemere whose judgment could be trusted. Seraphina Vale had just proven that narrative false. Quietly, methodically, without asking for credit or recognition or any of the currency that power typically demanded, and she had done it while he refused to look at her. "Eloise," he said. Seraphina blinked. "What?" "Your middle name. It is Eloise. It was in the marriage contract. I read every word of that document before I signed it." He held her gaze. "I have not spoken to you because I did not know how to speak to someone I was determined to resent. That is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and I am aware they are not the same thing." The silence that followed was unlike any silence that had existed between them before. It was not hostile. It was not performative. It was the silence of two people standing on ground that had just shifted beneath them and trying to determine whether the new terrain was stable enough to support what came next. "The minister falsifying the reports," Caedric said. "Do you have evidence?" "I have patterns. Lucien and I have been compiling discrepancies between the official harvest data and the actual conditions in the villages. The numbers point to Hargrove's office, but the diversion itself could be managed by anyone with access to the supply chain ledgers." "Hargrove." Caedric said the name the way a surgeon names the organ that needs to be removed. "How confident are you?" "Confident enough to present it formally. Not confident enough to guarantee it would survive a challenge in front of the full council without additional corroboration." "Then we get corroboration." Seraphina searched his face for the trap, for the pivot that would turn this conversation from apparent collaboration into the punishment she had been bracing for since he appeared in the garden. She found nothing. His expression was severe, but the quality of severity had changed. It was no longer directed at her, it was directed at the problem, at the failure, at the system he had built and the rot it had been hiding. "You're not going to punish me for going behind your back," she said. Not a question, an observation. Caedric's jaw worked. "I am going to punish the people who made it necessary for you to go behind my back. The distinction is relevant." He turned and walked toward the castle. After 3 steps, he stopped without looking back. "The council meets at noon. I expect you there." He did not wait for a response. He crossed the garden, entered the castle through the south corridor, and disappeared into the stone interior of Blackthorn Keep. Seraphina stood alone among the scattered lavender cuttings and realized that her hands were shaking, not from cold, from the sustained effort of holding herself together in front of a man whose attention, when finally directed at her, carried the force of a siege engine. She picked up her basket and followed him inside. The council meeting was a slaughter, not immediately. Caedric allowed the first 20 minutes to proceed normally. Ministers delivered their reports. Hargrove presented harvest figures for the Eastern Corridor, with the practiced confidence of a man who had been lying successfully for 3 years and saw no reason to stop. Lucian sat at the far end of the table, his expression carefully neutral, his eyes tracking between his brother and Seraphina, who occupied a chair at Caedric's right that had never previously been filled. The ministers noticed her presence. Several exchanged glances. Lord Pemberton opened his mouth to comment and then closed it when Caedric's gaze swept across him like a searchlight. Hargrove concluded his report. In summary, Your Grace, the Eastern Corridor remains productive, and the surplus projections for spring are favorable. I see no cause for concern. Caedric nodded slowly. Minister Hargrove, you have served this council for 11 years. 12 next March, Your Grace. In those 12 years, has the Eastern Corridor ever failed to meet your projected targets? Hargrove smiled. Never, Your Grace. I take considerable pride in the accuracy of my... Then explain to me why 7 villages in the Eastern Corridor are currently experiencing food shortages severe enough that families are abandoning generational farmland and children are starving. The room went airless. Hargrove's smile collapsed like a structure whose supports had been removed simultaneously. His eyes darted to the other ministers, to Pemberton, to the door, measuring distances, calculating escape routes. I am not certain where Your Grace received that information, but I can assure my wife received that information from the people living in those villages, people she has been feeding with her own resources because the administration responsible for their welfare was too busy producing fictional harvest reports to notice they were dying. Every head at the table turned towards Seraphina. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, her expression composed. She did not speak. She did not need to. Caedric was doing something he had never done before in her presence. He was acknowledging her, in public, in front of the men who had spent 6 weeks treating her like an ornamental embarrassment. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old candle wax. Your Grace, these allegations are documented. Caedric placed a leather folder on the table. Inside were the compiled discrepancies that Seraphina and Lucian had assembled. Page after page of numbers that told a story the official reports had been designed to bury. 3 years of falsified data, consistent inflation, directional bias. If this is incompetence, it is the most systematic incompetence I have ever encountered. If it is not incompetence, then it is theft, and I am disinclined to give you the benefit of the doubt. Hargrove stood. His chair scraped against the stone floor. I will not sit here and be accused by a woman whose father was convicted of... Sit down! Caedric did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The 2 words carried the weight of a man who had executed political opponents, bankrupted rival houses, and dismantled careers with the efficiency of a demolition crew. Hargrove sat. Your access to ducal accounts is suspended as of this moment. Your offices will be sealed and audited. You will remain in Blackthorn Keep until the investigation concludes. If you attempt to leave, I will treat it as an admission of guilt and act accordingly. Caedric paused. And if you ever reference my wife's family history as a defense for your own failures again, I will ensure that your family history becomes something no one in this duchy wishes to remember. The meeting dissolved. Ministers filed out in stunned silence. Hargrove was escorted from the chamber by 2 guards who materialized at the door as though Caedric had placed them there in advance, which he had. Lucian remained seated. He looked at his brother across the now empty table with an expression that mixed admiration, relief, and something close to sorrow. You could have done that 6 weeks ago, Lucian said quietly. If you had talked to her, if you had listened. Caedric gathered the documents from the table. I am aware. Are you? Because being aware and actually changing are different things, and you have historically excelled at the first while completely failing at the second. Lucienne. She is not your enemy, Caedric. She was never your enemy. The things you believed about her family, the narrative you built to justify treating her as less than nothing, that narrative was fed to you by the same people who have been feeding you false numbers for 3 years. Lucienne stood. Ask yourself who benefits from a duke who cannot trust his own wife. Lucienne walked out, leaving Caedric alone in the council chamber. The duke stood motionless beside the long oak table, scattered with documents that proved his own administration had been betraying him. The fire in the hearth had burned down to nothing. The room was cold. The silence was the kind that follows a detonation, thick with dust and the absence of everything that occupied the space before. He thought about Seraphina kneeling in frozen dirt, about letters written under a false name, about children in a village he had allowed to be erased from his own maps. He thought about a woman who had walked into his cathedral alone, married a man who would not look at her, and then spent 6 weeks saving his duchy while he spent 6 weeks pretending she did not exist. Something in his chest was no longer cracking. It had cracked. The breach was open, and what poured through it was not weakness, though he had spent his entire life calling it that. It was the recognition that the walls he had built to protect himself had also blinded him, and that the most dangerous thing he had ever done was not marrying Seraphina Vale. It was ignoring her. He left the council chamber and walked to the south corridor. Through the window, he could see the garden where they had stood that morning. The lavender cuttings were gone. Someone had gathered them. He placed his hand against the cold glass and stood there until the light faded. 4 days later, Caedric received a sealed dispatch from his intelligence network in the capital. He read it in his study. Alone, the fire burning, the wind tearing at the windows. The dispatch contained 3 pieces of information. First, House Mortain had formally petitioned Parliament to revoke the Valemere Charter, citing administrative mismanagement and failure of ducal governance. The petition had enough signatures to force a vote within 60 days. Second, the evidence supporting the petition included detailed accounts of the Eastern Corridor food shortages, accounts that could only have been compiled by someone with direct access to the villages, someone who had been there, someone who had seen the conditions firsthand and documented them with the precision of a trained analyst. Third, the intelligence agent had traced the leak to a single source inside Blackthorn Keep. The information had been transmitted through the same village courier network used to deliver letters addressed to Mrs. Ashton Gray. Caedric read the dispatch twice. Then he set it on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed with the controlled rhythm of a man preventing himself from destroying everything within reach. Someone had taken Seraphina's relief network and weaponized it. Someone had used her supply routes, her village contacts, her carefully built channels of trust, to smuggle intelligence about Valemere's weaknesses directly into the hands of the one house that wanted to destroy him. Either she knew and had been working against him from the beginning, or she did not know and had been used as an instrument of his destruction without her knowledge or consent. Both possibilities were catastrophic, but only one of them was survivable. And Caedric Ravenshade, alone in his study with the fire-casting shadows that looked like the bars of a cage, understood with absolute clarity that the next conversation he had with his wife would either save his duchy or end everything he had left. He pulled the bell cord to summon Voss. Bring the Duchess to me, now, and make sure my brother does not know. Seraphina arrived in his study 17 minutes after the summons. She wore a gray wool dress without ornament. Her hair was pulled back in the manner she adopted when working, which Caedric now understood meant she had been in the library or the kitchen garden, or somewhere else inside his castle doing things he was only beginning to comprehend. She entered without knocking because Voss had told her the Duke required her presence immediately, and immediacy in Blackthorn Keep did not accommodate courtesy. She saw his face and stopped 3 steps inside the door. Whatever she had expected, it was not this. Caedric stood behind his desk with both hands pressed flat against the surface as though holding himself upright through mechanical force. The dispatch lay open between his palms. The fire behind him threw his shadow long and distorted across the floor. His eyes were the color of winter slate, and they held something she had never seen in them before. Not anger. Anger she could navigate. Anger had structure and direction and could be redirected with the right application of logic and composure. This was bewilderment, the kind that comes when a man who has spent his entire life trusting his own judgment discovers that his judgment has been insufficient. Not wrong. Insufficient. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a wound that heals and one that changes the shape of the body permanently. "Close the door," Caedric said. She closed it. "Sit down." "I will stand." His jaw tightened, but he did not insist. Instead, he picked up the dispatch and held it out across the desk. Seraphina crossed the room and took it from his hand. Their fingers did not touch. She read the document once, quickly, her eyes moving across the lines with the speed of someone trained to extract information under pressure. Then she read it again, slowly, and Caedric watched the blood drain from her face in real time. It started at her cheeks and moved downward, leaving her skin the color of paper, and her hand holding the dispatch began to tremble in a way she could not disguise. "This is not possible," she said. "And yet, Caedric, I did not do this. I know." She looked up from the document. The trembling stopped. "How do you know?" "Because if you were working for House Mortain, you would not have spent 6 weeks feeding starving villages with your own money. Espionage does not typically require personal financial sacrifice. And because the information in that petition mirrors the conditions you documented but frames them as evidence of my failure rather than evidence of ministerial corruption. Someone took your work and inverted its purpose." He paused. "The question is who had access to your courier network?" Seraphina set the dispatch on the desk. Her hands were steady now. The initial shock had passed, and what replaced it was the focused stillness that Caedric had first noticed at the wedding feast, the composure of a woman who had been ambushed before and knew that panic was a luxury she could not afford. "The network was small. I used village contacts, farmers' wives, school teachers, people with no political connections and no reason to communicate with anyone outside their communities. Someone in that chain is not who you believe them to be. Or someone intercepted the correspondence without being part of the chain at all." Seraphina's eyes narrowed. "The letters went through the Eldermere supply route, the same route that services Blackthorn Keep's kitchens. Anyone with access to the supply carts could have copied the contents without disturbing the delivery. Which means someone inside this castle." The words settled between them like sediment in disturbed water. Someone inside Blackthorn Keep had been reading Seraphina's private correspondence, extracting intelligence about Valemere's vulnerabilities, and transmitting it to the Mortain network. Not a minister, not a rival lord positioned at a comfortable distance. Someone who walked these corridors, someone who ate at these tables, someone close enough to observe the Duchess's movements and patient enough to exploit them without detection. Caedric's mind began assembling a list of suspects with the mechanical precision that had made him the most feared political operator in the northern duchies. Staff with access to the supply routes, servants who handled correspondence, anyone who had arrived at Blackthorn Keep within the past year, and whose background had not been subjected to the full scrutiny his intelligence network was capable of conducting. Then a thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. Lucien knew about the courier network. Seraphina's expression hardened. "Do not." "He had access. He helped you build it. He knew the routes, the contacts, the delivery schedule." "Lucien would not betray you. Everyone in my life has eventually betrayed me. It is not a question of character. It is a question of incentive." Caedric's voice was flat, but his breathing had changed, shorter, tighter, the rhythm of a body absorbing impact. "My brother stands to inherit Valemere if the charter is revoked and the duchy is restructured under parliamentary authority. He has always been more popular than me, more liked, more trusted. If Mortain succeeds, Lucien could position himself as the alternative, the reasonable Ravenshade, the one the people actually wanted. You do not believe that. What I believe is irrelevant. What the evidence supports is the only thing that has ever kept me alive." Seraphina stepped closer to the desk. "Then look at the evidence, Caedric. All of it. Not just the parts that confirm the story you are most comfortable telling yourself. Lucien came to Valemere because you asked him to. He helped me because he saw what I saw, that your duchy was failing and you were too proud to notice. If he wanted to destroy you, he had 100 easier ways to do it than helping your wife feed your people. Caedric stared at her. His hands were still pressed against the desk. The fire cracked behind him, sending a shower of sparks against the grate that sounded like something small and brittle shattering. She was asking him to do something he had never done. She was asking him to choose trust over evidence, to decide, in the absence of proof, that the people closest to him were not the ones trying to destroy him. Every instinct he had ever developed screamed against it. Every lesson his father had beaten into him, literally and figuratively, said that trust was a vulnerability and vulnerability was death. But his instincts and his father's lessons had also produced a man who could not see his own wife standing in front of him for 6 weeks. A man whose ministers lied to his face because he had made truth-telling a punishable offense. A man whose duchy was starving while he fought phantom wars in gilded rooms. His instincts had built a kingdom of fear and then blinded him to the fact that it was crumbling from within. "I need to speak to my brother," Caedric said. "Then speak to him as a brother, not as a duke conducting a tribunal." He did not promise. She did not expect him to. She left the study without another word, and the room felt smaller after she was gone, as though she had been occupying more space in it than her physical dimensions accounted for. Caedric found Lucien in the armory. His brother was sitting on a wooden bench beneath a wall of mounted swords, cleaning a hunting rifle with an oiled cloth. The armory was cold. No fire. The only light came from narrow windows set high in the stone walls, and it fell across Lucien's face in slashes of gray and white that made him look older than he was. Lucien did not look up when Caedric entered. "If you have come to accuse me of something, do it quickly. I have a ride planned for this afternoon, and I would hate to miss the daylight." Caedric closed the armory door. The latch engaged with a sound that echoed off the stone. "House Mortain has petitioned Parliament to revoke the Valemere Charter." Lucien's hand stilled on the rifle. Then they resumed their work, slower than before. "When?" "The petition was filed 4 days ago. We have 60 days before the vote." "On what grounds?" "Administrative failure? Specifically, documented evidence of food shortages and infrastructure collapse in the Eastern Corridor. Evidence that was gathered through Seraphina's courier network and transmitted to the Mortain intelligence operation by someone with access to her correspondence inside this castle." Lucien set down the rifle and the cloth. He looked at his brother for the first time since Caedric had entered the room. His expression was not defensive. It was not frightened. It was exhausted. The bone-deep kind that comes from carrying weight in silence for too long. "And you are here to determine whether that someone was me. I am here to ask." "Since when do you ask?" "The Caedric I know issues demands and draws conclusions. Asking is new." "A great many things are new." Lucien studied him. The silence between them stretched until it developed its own texture, thick and complicated and loaded with 30 years of shared history that included a dead father, a dying estate, and the fundamental divergence of 2 brothers who processed grief in opposite directions. One by closing down. One by opening up. And neither understanding the other's method well enough to bridge the gap. "I did not leak her information," Lucien said. "I am going to say that once, and I need you to hear it, because I am not going to repeat it, and I am not going to defend it. If you cannot take my word, then we are already finished, and the Mortains do not need to lift another finger because this family will destroy itself without assistance." Caedric leaned against the stone wall. The cold seeped through his coat and into his shoulders. He let it. The discomfort grounded him in a way that the controlled warmth of his study never did. "If not you, then who?" Lucien exhaled slowly. "Someone who understood Seraphina's value before either of us did. Someone who watched her build that network and saw not a relief operation, but a ready-made intelligence pipeline. Someone inside the castle with enough access to monitor her movements and enough sophistication to know what Mortain would pay for that information. That describes half my household staff. It describes one person who arrived at Blackthorn Keep 3 months before your wedding and positioned themselves in the one role that gives them access to every incoming and outgoing communication in this castle." Caedric's breathing stopped. The name arrived in his mind before Lucien said it, rising from the depths of his subconscious like a body surfacing in dark water. "Voss." Lucien nodded. "Your personal steward. The man who told you about Seraphina's letters. The man who brought you exactly enough information to make you suspicious of your wife while deflecting attention from himself. Think about it. He intercepted the letter from Briarfield. He told you about the correspondence. He suggested Seraphina was hiding something. He pointed you toward her and away from the actual leak. Voss has served me for 15 years. Voss has served your household for 15 years. There is a difference between serving a man and being loyal to him, and you of all people should understand that distinction because you built an entire political philosophy on it. Caedric pushed off the wall. He paced the length of the armory, his boots striking the stone with a rhythm that accelerated with each pass. The swords on the walls gleamed dully in the gray light. His reflection moved across the polished blades in fractured pieces, and for a disorienting moment he could not tell which fragment was the real one. Voss. Aldrich Voss. The man who managed his schedule, who controlled access to his chambers, who screened his correspondence and organized his files and stood outside his door during private meetings. The man Caedric had trusted, not because Voss had earned that trust through any particular act of courage or sacrifice, but because Voss had been present for so long that his presence had become indistinguishable from the furniture. And that was exactly the kind of trust that could be exploited. The kind that was never examined, because examining it would require admitting that it had never been tested. 15 years of reliable service, and Caedric could not identify a single moment where Voss had been forced to choose between loyalty and self-interest, because Voss had designed it that way. The realization hit Caedric's nervous system before it reached his intellect. His stomach contracted, his hands curled into fists, the back of his neck went hot and then cold. He stopped pacing and stood absolutely still in the center of the armory with his fists at his sides and his eyes fixed on the far wall where a single sword hung apart from the others, older and less ornate, its blade notched from actual combat rather than ceremonial display. His father's sword. "Where is Voss now?" Caedric's voice came out stripped of everything except function. "I saw him near the east corridor 20 minutes ago, heading toward the lower archives." The archives, Caedric's eyes narrowed. The archives where Seraphina's compiled discrepancy reports are stored. The brothers looked at each other. The same thought arrived simultaneously. Voss was not retrieving documents for the Duke's benefit. He was retrieving them because the Mortain petition would need specific numbers to survive parliamentary scrutiny, and the most specific numbers in Valemere existed in the files that Seraphina had assembled and stored in the East Wing archives as evidence against Hargrove. Voss was completing his collection, taking the last pieces of the weapon that would be used to destroy the Ravenshade charter. Caedric moved toward the door. "Wait." Lucian stood from the bench. "If you confront him now, he will deny it, and you will have nothing but suspicion. He has been doing this for months, possibly longer. He knows how to cover his movements. You need evidence, not a confrontation." "I need him stopped." "You need him exposed. There is a difference, and the difference matters. If you drag your steward before the council on suspicion alone, it looks like a duke unraveling. The Mortains will use it. The petition gains credibility. Your own nobles start questioning whether the charter should survive." Lucian picked up his jacket from the bench. "Let me handle it." "How?" "I will watch him. I know the lower archives better than he does. If he is removing documents, I will see it happen, and I will have witnesses." "Lucien, trust me." 2 words. Delivered without charm, without his usual deflective humor, without any of the social armor that Lucien typically wore like a second skin. Just a man asking his brother for something that both of them knew had never been freely given. Caedric stood at the armory door with his hand on the latch and the weight of a decision pressing down on him that had nothing to do with politics or strategy or the survival of his duchy. This was about something older and more fundamental. This was about whether a man who had built his life on the principle that trust was weakness could reverse that principle in time to save the people he had been pushing away for 30 years. He released the latch. "Go. Report to me within the hour." Lucien moved past him and was gone. Caedric stood alone in the armory. Cold air filled his lungs. The old sword hung on the wall in front of him, its notched blade a record of every fight his father had survived through force alone. Force had not been enough. His father died at 52 in this very castle, surrounded by wealth and power and a legacy that amounted to an empire held together by fear. He died without a single person in the room who mourned him. The physicians attended his body with clinical efficiency. The ministers began repositioning before the body was cold. And Caedric, 19 years old and already harder than any teenager should have been, stood at the foot of his father's bed and felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Because his father had spent a lifetime ensuring that his son's emotional vocabulary contained exactly 2 entries: strength and everything that was not strength. Caedric had inherited that vocabulary and expanded it into a governing philosophy. He had run Valemere the same way his father had run it, through intimidation and control and the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the structure. And the structure had held. For a decade, it had held. But structures built on fear required constant maintenance. They demanded that every crack be filled immediately, every dissenter be silenced, every vulnerability be concealed. And the cost of that maintenance was that the builder eventually became a prisoner of his own architecture, unable to step outside the walls because stepping outside would mean seeing the foundation for what it actually was. Hollow. The word arrived in Caedric's mind with a clarity that felt like a blade being drawn. Hollow. His duchy was hollow. His court was hollow. His relationships were hollow. 15 years of service from a man who was selling him to his enemies. 6 weeks of marriage to a woman who was saving his people while he pretended she did not exist. A brother who had been trying to help and had received suspicion in return. Everything he had built was a shell, impressive from the outside, empty within. And the only person who had tried to fill it with something real was the woman he had married for her money and refused to look at for 6 weeks. Caedric left the armory and walked to the east wing. He did not go to the archives. He did not go to his study. He went to Seraphina's chambers, where he had never once set foot since the day she moved in. He knocked. She opened the door and found him standing in the corridor with no pretense, no political maneuvering, no strategic agenda. Just a man who looked like he had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally realized he could not carry it alone. "We need to talk," he said. "Not as Duke and Duchess, not as political allies. I need to tell you what I've spent a decade becoming, and I need you to tell me whether anything in it is worth saving." Seraphina studied his face. The hallway behind him was empty. The torchlight threw warm shadows across the angular planes of his features, softening them in ways that the cold precision of his study never had. He was not performing. She had watched him perform for 7 weeks, and she knew every variation of the mask. This was not a mask. She stepped aside and let him in. And in that moment, with the armory behind him, the archives being watched by the brother he had chosen to trust, and a traitor still moving freely through his castle, Caedric Ravenshade crossed a threshold that had nothing to do with doorways. He had spent 10 years becoming a man no one could reach. Now he was standing inside the room of the one person who had reached him anyway, and the only path forward required him to become someone his father would not have recognized, someone the court would not understand, someone who could hold power and vulnerability in the same hand without letting either one destroy the other. Behind him, somewhere in the lower corridors of Blackthorn Keep, Aldrich Voss descended toward the archives with a leather satchel and the quiet confidence of a man who believed he was still invisible. He was not. But what neither Caedric nor Lucian nor Seraphina knew, what none of them could have anticipated, was that Voss was not working alone. And the person standing behind Voss in the Mortagne network was not a rival lord or a foreign agent or any of the enemies Caedric had spent a decade preparing to fight. It was someone who had sat at Caedric's own council table that morning, someone who had watched the Duke defend his wife and dismantle Hargrove and display, for the first time in his reign, a crack in the armor that had made him untouchable, and that someone had already sent word to the capital that the Duke of Valemere was changing, and that he needed to be stopped before the change was complete. Seraphina closed the door behind him and did not speak. The room was smaller than Caedric expected. He had given her the West Wing's finest chambers on paper, but standing inside them now, he saw what paper did not capture. The furniture was functional, not ornamental. The fireplace was modest, suited for a guest room rather than a duchess's quarters. The curtains were heavy, but threadbare at the hems where years of use had thinned the fabric. Someone on his household staff had interpreted his indifference toward his wife as permission to furnish her rooms with whatever was left over after the important spaces had been appointed. He cataloged these details the way he cataloged battlefield intelligence. Quickly, completely, and with the growing awareness that each one represented a failure he had authored through neglect. Seraphina stood near the writing desk with her arms crossed. The locked drawer where she kept her correspondence was visible behind her left hip. She was not blocking it deliberately. She had simply positioned herself in the part of the room she occupied most, and that happened to be the desk where she conducted the work that had been quietly holding his duchy together. "You said you needed to tell me what you have become," she said. "I am listening." Caedric remained standing near the door. The distance between them was 10 feet, but it felt architectural, load-bearing, as though closing it would require demolishing something structural first. "My father ruled Valemere for 23 years, he said. In that time, he tripled the duchy's territory, bankrupted 4 rival houses, and built a political machine that controlled parliamentary votes across the entire northern bloc. He was the most powerful duke in the kingdom. He was also the most hated man I have ever known." Seraphina said nothing. She watched him the way she watched everything, with precision and patience and the unsettling capacity to hold silence longer than the person filling it. "He taught me that power was the only thing that could not be taken from you without your consent, that love was a negotiating liability, that trust was a door you left unlocked for your enemies." Caedric's voice was level, but the words cost him something visible, a tightness around his eyes, a compression of the muscles along his jaw. I believed him. I built everything on that foundation, and now I am standing in my wife's bedroom for the first time in 7 weeks, telling her that the foundation is cracked and I do not know how to pour a new one. "You are not here for absolution," Seraphina said. "I cannot give you that, and you would not respect it if I did. So tell me what you are actually asking for." He looked at her, directly, without the deflection or the strategic distance or any of the mechanisms he deployed to keep people at arm's length. And what Seraphina saw in that look made her breath catch against her ribs in a way she did not allow to reach her face. He was terrified. Not of the Mortaines, not of Parliament, not of the political annihilation bearing down on his duchy with the inevitability of a winter storm. He was terrified of the thing he was about to do, which was ask another human being for help without any guarantee that the asking would not destroy him. "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a financial arrangement, not as a contractual obligation. I'm asking you to stay because you see things I cannot see, and you do things I'm not capable of doing, and because this duchy needs what you have been building in secret more than it needs anything I have built in the open." He paused. "And because I have spent 10 years convincing myself that I do not need anyone, and the lie is finally more exhausting than the truth." The fire crackled, wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere deep in the castle, a door opened and closed with the distant sound of iron on stone. Seraphina uncrossed her arms. "Then we start now, tonight. Because we do not have 60 days, Caedric. We have far less than that." She was right, and the proof arrived within the hour. Lucien found them in the West Wing corridor. He was moving fast, his coat unbuttoned, his face carrying the expression of a man who had just witnessed something that rearranged his understanding of the threat they were facing. He stopped in front of Caedric and Seraphina and spoke in a voice stripped down to function. "Voss is gone." Caedric's body went rigid. "What do you mean, gone?" "I followed him to the lower archives. He spent 14 minutes inside. When he came out, he was carrying the satchel, and it was full. I followed him to the east courtyard, where a horse was already saddled and waiting. He mounted and rode out through the service gate before I could get close enough to stop him." Lucien's jaw was tight. He had this planned. The horse was staged. The gate was unlatched from the inside. He has been preparing an exit route for weeks. "Where's he heading?" "South Road, which puts him on the direct route to Marchford, where the Mortaine family maintains a private estate and a courier office with connections to the capital." Caedric processed the information in 3 seconds. Voss had the compiled discrepancy reports from the archives. Those reports, in Mortaine's hands, would provide the specific numerical evidence needed to make the parliamentary petition not just credible, but devastating. They would prove that Valemere's administration had been failing for years. They would prove that the Duke either knew about the failures and concealed them, or did not know about them and was therefore incompetent. Either interpretation was fatal to the charter, and Voss had a 3-hour head start on a road that Caedric's riders could not cover faster than Voss's fresh horse. "There is something else," Lucien said. His voice dropped. "I found this in the archives after Voss left." He held out a folded document. Caedric took it and opened it. The handwriting was not Voss's. It was elegant, practiced, the penmanship of someone educated at the finest institutions, and Caedric recognized it immediately because he had read documents in this handwriting for 7 years. Lord Pemberton. The letter was addressed to Voss and dated 3 weeks earlier. Its contents were concise and transactional. It outlined a payment schedule for information delivered to an unnamed third party, referenced specific documents by the filing codes used in Valemere's internal archive system, and concluded with a single instruction. When the Duke shows weakness, move everything. When the Duke shows weakness, the council meeting. The moment Caedric defended Seraphina and dismantled Hargrove in front of the assembled ministers. Pemberton had been sitting at that table. He had watched Caedric acknowledge his wife, admit his administration's failures, and display for the first time in his reign a crack in the armor of absolute control. And Pemberton had interpreted that crack not as growth but as vulnerability, not as a Duke evolving but as a Duke breaking, and he had given Voss the signal to extract every remaining piece of evidence and run. Caedric's vision narrowed. The corridor around him compressed until the only things that existed were the letter in his hand and the tactical reality it represented. 2 traitors. One already in flight with documents that could dismantle the Ravenshade Charter. One still inside Blackthorn Keep, presumably unaware that his written instructions had been discovered. The man who had survived a decade of political warfare by being the most calculating person in every room understood that the next 4 hours would determine whether his dynasty survived or was ground into rubble by the parliamentary machinery he had spent years trying to control. He folded Pemberton's letter and placed it inside his coat. "Lucien, take 6 riders and intercept Voss on the South Road. He cannot reach Marchford. And if he resists?" "He will not resist. He is a bureaucrat, not a soldier. But the documents he carries do not reach Mortain under any circumstances, whatever it takes." Lucien nodded once and moved toward the stairwell. His footsteps echoed off the stone and then faded. Caedric turned to Seraphina. "Pemberton is still in the castle." "I know." "He does not know we have his letter. He believes Voss has escaped cleanly and that the operation is proceeding according to plan, which means he will behave normally until he receives confirmation from Marchford, and that gives us a window." "How long?" "If Lucien intercepts Voss, Pemberton will never receive that confirmation. He will grow nervous, he will attempt to contact Mortain through an alternative channel, or he will try to leave Blackthorn Keep himself. Either way, he will move, and when he moves, we catch him." "And if Lucien does not intercept Voss?" Caedric did not answer immediately. The alternative scenario unfolded in his mind with the clarity of a tactical simulation. Documents reaching Marchford. Mortain presenting specific evidence to Parliament. A vote that could not be stopped. The Ravenshade Charter revoked. Valemere dissolved into subordinate territories. His family's legacy erased not by war, but by bureaucracy. "Then I go to Parliament myself," Caedric said, "and I make the case that the corruption was real, but the response was already underway. That my wife identified the failures the administration concealed, and that reforms are being implemented. That the charter should be preserved not because of what Valemere was, but because of what it is becoming." Seraphina stared at him. "You would stand before Parliament and admit failure." "I would stand before Parliament and tell the truth, which is something I have not done in a very long time, and which may, for that reason, be the only move they do not expect." The corridor was empty. The torchlight cast their shadows on the stone wall behind them, elongated and merged at the edges so that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. "There is a third option," Seraphina said quietly. "Tell me." "The petition relies on evidence of administrative failure. If we can demonstrate that the failure was not the result of ducal mismanagement, but of deliberate sabotage by agents working for House Mortain within Valemere's own government, the petition does not just fail, it reverses. Mortain becomes the aggressor. Parliament investigates them instead of you." That requires proof that Pemberton and Voss were operating under Mortaine's direction. The letter establishes Pemberton's involvement but does not name Mortaine directly. Then we make Pemberton name them. Caedric looked at his wife with an expression that contained, for the first time, something that was not calculation or strategy or the careful management of political variables. It was recognition. The deep, uncomfortable kind that comes from realizing that the person standing in front of you has been thinking 3 moves ahead while you were still processing the current position. You want to interrogate a sitting lord of the realm in my own castle. I want to give a desperate man the opportunity to save himself by telling the truth. There is a difference. Pemberton is not a zealot. He is not loyal to Mortaine out of conviction. He did this for money and position, which means his loyalty has a price, and fear is a currency he will accept. Caedric almost smiled. It did not reach his mouth, but it moved behind his eyes like light shifting beneath ice. You are more dangerous than I gave you credit for. You gave me no credit at all. Anything above 0 is an improvement. He turned toward the main corridor. Have Pemberton summoned to the council chamber. Not by me. Have one of the household staff inform him that a routine session has been called to discuss the Eastern Corridor reforms. He will come because refusing would look suspicious. He does not yet know he is cornered. And when he arrives? He finds the Duke and the Duchess of Valemere sitting at the table with his own letter in front of them and the door locked behind him. And then we see how much Lord Pemberton's allegiance to House Mortaine is worth when the alternative is losing everything he owns. Seraphina moved toward the servants' stairway. She paused at the top of the stairs without turning around. For the record, this is the man I expected to marry. She descended before he could respond. Caedric stood in the corridor alone. His heart was beating at a rate he had not experienced since the last time someone tried to kill him, which was 4 years ago in a carriage ambush on the road to the capital. But the quality of the adrenaline was different. It was not the cold, mechanical surge of a man preparing to fight for survival. It was heated, charged, the kind that came from operating in tandem with another mind that matched his own and challenged it simultaneously. He had spent 10 years believing that partnership was a weakness, that the strongest position was the solitary one, that the man who needed no one was the man who could not be broken. He had been wrong. The man who needed no one was simply the man who had not yet found the person worth needing. And now that he had found her, the terror of losing her was not a weakness. It was fuel, the most volatile and efficient fuel a human being could burn. Pemberton arrived at the council chamber at 8:30. He entered with the casual confidence of a man who had been attending these meetings for 7 years and knew exactly how to perform loyalty while conducting treason. His coat was brushed. His collar was straight. He carried a leather portfolio of notes that he placed on the table with the practiced gesture of a prepared minister. Then he saw the room. Empty. No ministers, no clerks, no servants. The long oak table had been cleared of everything except a single document placed face up at the center. 2 chairs were occupied. Caedric sat at the head. Seraphina sat to his right. The fire was burning high and the room was uncomfortably warm, which was deliberate. Heat made people talk. Caedric had learned that from his father, and it was one of the few lessons he did not regret inheriting. Pemberton's eyes went to the document on the table. The color left his face in stages, starting at his hairline and moving down like a tide retreating from a shore. He recognized his own handwriting. "Sit down, Lord Pemberton," Caedric said. Pemberton did not sit. His eyes moved from the letter to the Duke, to the Duchess, to the door behind him, measuring distance and probability with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. "The door is locked," Seraphina said, "and the guards outside it are not yours." Pemberton's throat worked. He gripped the back of the nearest chair. "This is not what it appears. It appears to be a letter from you to my personal steward outlining a payment schedule for intelligence delivered to House Mortaine. If it is not what it appears, I invite you to explain what it actually is." Caedric's voice was flat and precise and carried the temperature of a surgical instrument. "Take your time. We have all night." "Caedric, you must understand the political situation, the pressures. You cannot possibly—" "Sit down." Pemberton sat. His hands were shaking. He placed them flat on the table in an unconscious mirror of the posture Caedric had adopted in his study hours earlier, and the symmetry was not lost on the Duke. Two men pressing their palms against wood to keep themselves from falling apart. The difference was that Caedric had been falling apart in private. Pemberton was doing it in front of the two people who would decide whether he survived the night politically. "How long have you been working for Mortain?" Seraphina asked. Pemberton's eyes darted to her. There was a flash of the old contempt, the reflex of a man who had spent 6 weeks dismissing her as a decorative irrelevance. It died when he looked at her face. Whatever he saw there killed it. 2 years, he said. "Since before my marriage," Caedric said. "Since before the marriage was announced. Mortain approached me after the third quarterly deficit. They said Valemere was going to fall regardless. They offered me a position in the restructured territory if I helped accelerate the timeline. And you believed them." "I believed the numbers. Your duchy was hemorrhaging revenue. Your ministers were incompetent or corrupt. You were burning political capital on feuds that produced nothing. I made a calculation." "You made a calculation." Caedric repeated the words with the precision of a man dismantling a mechanism to study its components. "You sat at my table for 2 years. You ate my food, you drank my wine, you voted in my council, and the entire time you were feeding intelligence to the house that wants to erase my family from the map. You would have done the same thing." The words fell into the room like a match into dry kindling. Pemberton said them with the desperate conviction of a man who needed to believe that his betrayal was rational rather than venal, that the calculus of self-preservation justified the destruction of the structure that had sheltered him. Caedric leaned forward. "No, I would not have done the same thing, because I do not betray the people who trust me. I fail them in other ways. I ignore them. I shut them out. I build walls so high that the people inside them suffocate, but I do not sell them to their enemies for a promise and a pension." The room was silent except for the fire and the sound of Pemberton's breathing, which had become ragged and irregular. "You have 2 options," Seraphina said. Her voice was steady. Clinical. She might have been reading terms from a contract. "You can provide a full signed confession detailing your arrangement with House Mortain, including names, dates, payment amounts, and the specific intelligence you transmitted. That confession will be submitted to Parliament as evidence that the Valemere Charter was undermined not by administrative failure, but by foreign sabotage. In exchange, you will be permitted to resign your title and leave the duchy without criminal prosecution." "And the second option?" "The second option is that you say nothing, and tomorrow morning the Duke of Valemere presents this letter to the full council along with Aldrich Voss's testimony, which my brother-in-law is currently in the process of obtaining. Your lands are seized, your family is investigated, and House Mortain learns that their inside man was compromised because he was careless enough to put instructions in writing." Pemberton looked at Caedric. "Is she speaking for you?" "She is speaking with me, which is a concept you should become familiar with because it is the only reason you are being offered a choice instead of a sentence." The fire popped, a log shifted in the grate. Sparks rose and died in the heated air. Pemberton looked at the letter on the table, at his own handwriting, at the words that documented the price of his loyalty and the terms of his betrayal, set down in ink that could not be erased or reinterpreted or spun into something more palatable. "I will need guarantees," he said hoarsely. "You will get terms. Guarantees are for people who have not committed treason." Seraphina produced paper, ink, and a pen from beneath the table. She set them in front of Pemberton without ceremony. "Start with Mortain. Names, dates, everything. Leave nothing out because we will verify every detail, and any omission will be treated as a continuation of hostilities." Pemberton picked up the pen. His hand was still trembling, but the decision had been made. The animal calculation of a man who understood that survival required surrender and that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He began to write. Caedric watched him. The scratch of the pen on paper was the only sound in the room. Each line Pemberton wrote was another nail in the Mortain coffin and another brick removed from the political structure that had been threatening to bury Valemere for years. But Caedric was not thinking about Mortain. He was thinking about the woman beside him, about the way she had walked into this room and executed a strategy that combined compassion and ruthlessness in proportions he had never considered possible. She had offered Pemberton mercy, not because she was soft, but because mercy, deployed at the right moment, was more devastating than punishment. It stripped the target of their defenses by giving them something they did not deserve and could not reciprocate. It was, he realized, exactly what she had been doing in the villages, offering help to people who had no claim on her generosity. Building loyalty that could not be purchased because it was not transactional. Creating a foundation that held not because it was enforced, but because it was earned. His father would have called it weakness. His father would have been wrong. Pemberton wrote for 47 minutes. When he finished, the confession filled 6 pages. Seraphina collected them without reading them in his presence. Caedric stood. "You will remain in your chambers until further notice. You will speak to no one. If I learn that you have attempted to contact anyone outside this castle, the terms we discussed become void." Pemberton stood on unsteady legs. He looked at the Duke and the Duchess one final time with the hollowed expression of a man who had just signed away everything he spent a lifetime accumulating. "For what it is worth," he said at the door, "she is the reason I am cooperating, not you." He left. Caedric and Seraphina sat alone in the council chamber. The fire was dying. The room was cooling. Pemberton's confession lay on the table between them, 6 pages of handwritten betrayal that could save a duchy or ignite a war depending on how they were deployed. Caedric reached across the table and placed his hand over Seraphina's. She did not pull away. Her fingers were cold. His were not. The contact lasted 3 seconds and carried more weight than any words spoken between them in 7 weeks of marriage. Then hoofbeats erupted in the courtyard below. Caedric was at the window in 2 strides, riders coming through the main gate. 6 horses. Lucien at the front, still mounted, shouting orders to the grooms. And behind him, bound across the saddle of the last horse like cargo, the limp and bloodied form of Aldrich Voss. Lucien looked up at the council chamber window. His face was bruised. His coat was torn. His expression carried something Caedric had never seen on his brother's face before. Fear. Not fear of violence or physical danger. Lucien had just ridden down a traitor on a frozen road and dragged him back by force. That kind of fear he could handle. This was different. This was the fear of a man who had discovered something during the pursuit that changed the scale of the threat from political maneuvering to something far more immediate and far more lethal. Lucien cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted up at the window, his voice cracking against the stone walls of the courtyard. "They are coming! Mortain has riders on the north road, armed, 40 men, maybe more. They will be here before dawn." Seraphina appeared at Caedric's shoulder. She looked down at the courtyard, at the exhausted horses and the bound traitor in Lucien's battered face, and she understood with the clarity that survival demands what this meant. Mortain was not waiting for Parliament. Mortain was not relying on petitions or votes or the slow machinery of political destruction. They had seen the operation inside Blackthorn Keep begin to collapse. They had lost their inside men. And they had made the decision that ambitious, desperate houses always eventually make when the legal path to power closes in front of them. They were coming to take Valemere by force. Caedric turned from the window. His face had changed. The vulnerability that had surfaced over the past 12 hours, the openness, the willingness to question himself, all of it was still there. But it had been compressed into something harder and more functional. Fused with the tactical ruthlessness that had kept him alive for a decade until the 2 qualities were no longer separate elements but a single alloy, stronger than either one alone. He looked at Seraphina. "Stay or go. Your choice. I will not hold you to a marriage contract during a siege." Seraphina looked back at him with eyes that held no fear and no hesitation and no trace of the careful, guarded composure she had worn like armor since the day she arrived at Blackthorn Keep. "I did not rebuild your villages to watch them burn." Caedric held her gaze for 1 second. 2. Then he moved. He descended the stairwell at a pace that forced the guards outside the council chamber to run to keep up. He hit the courtyard at a dead sprint, his boots cracking against the frozen cobblestones, and reached Lucien as his brother dismounted. "How long?" 4 hours, 5 at most. They are moving fast and they are not trying to hide it. Blackthorn Keep was built to withstand a siege. Blackthorn Keep was built to withstand a medieval siege. These are not medieval soldiers, Caedric. They are mercenaries with modern weapons and Mortain money. The walls will hold, but the gates are another question. Caedric turned to the captain of his household guard, a scarred veteran named Drayton, who had served the Ravenshade family since before Caedric's father died. Drayton, full defensive posture, every man armed, seal the service gate, reinforce the main gate with everything we have, and send riders to the eastern villages, now. Drayton frowned. The eastern villages, Your Grace? My wife has spent 2 months earning the loyalty of every farmer, teacher, and laborer in the eastern corridor. Those people know this land better than Mortaine's mercenaries ever will. Send word that Blackthorn Keep is under threat and ask, do not command, ask if they are willing to stand with us. Drayton looked at Seraphina, who had followed Caedric into the courtyard and was standing in the freezing air without a coat, her gray dress dark against the torchlight, her face set with an expression that would have been at home on a battlefield commander. Yes, Your Grace, Drayton said, and moved. The castle erupted into organized chaos. Servants carried supplies. Guards took positions. Doors were barricaded. Weapons were distributed. And through all of it, Caedric Ravenshade moved with the lethal efficiency of a man who had finally stopped fighting against himself and started fighting for something worth defending. At the main gate he paused and looked back across the courtyard. Seraphina stood at the entrance to the great hall, silhouetted against the light pouring from inside. Lucien stood beside her. Behind them both, the ancient stones of Blackthorn Keep rose into a sky that was beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. Dawn was coming. And with it, the battle that would determine whether the Ravenshade legacy ended tonight or was reborn in the hands of a ruthless duke, a fearless duchess, and a brotherhood that had survived everything except the one test that actually mattered. The first riders from Eldermere arrived 2 hours before dawn. They came on farm horses and mules and one ancient draft mare whose ribs showed through her winter coat. 14 men carrying axes, pitchforks, and hunting bows that had not been used for anything larger than rabbits in a decade. They rode through the main gate of Blackthorn Keep and dismounted in the courtyard with the bewildered determination of people who had never been inside the castle walls and were not entirely certain they were permitted to be there now. Caedric watched from the rampart above the gate. Seraphina stood beside him. Neither spoke as a second group arrived from Briarfield, then a third from Thornbrook, the village that had been erased from his maps, 11 men and 3 women carrying weapons improvised from farm tools and carpentry equipment. They came because a rider had told them the Silver Lady needed help. That was enough. No titles invoked, no feudal obligations cited, just the name of a woman who had fed their children and rebuilt their wells, and the understanding that debts of that nature are not owed but chosen. By the time the eastern horizon began to separate into bands of gray and pale gold, 43 villagers stood in the courtyard of Blackthorn Keep, alongside Caedric's 60 household guards. Against Mortaine's professional mercenaries, the numbers were not favorable. The equipment was worse. But the faces looking up at the rampart held something that Caedric recognized from a distance, because he had spent years studying its absence in his own court. Conviction. These people were not here because they feared punishment for refusing. They were here because someone had given them a reason to fight that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with the basic human need to protect what had protected them. Caedric descended to the courtyard. The villagers parted for him with the uncertain deference of people encountering authority at close range for the first time. He walked to the center of the group and stopped beside a bearded man in his 50s who held a woodcutter's axe across his shoulder with the ease of someone who had been swinging it since childhood. "Your name," Caedric said. "Thomas Holt, Briarfield." "Holt, your wife wrote letters to mine." "She did." "Your duchess kept my youngest alive through the worst winter in 20 years. That is not something a man forgets." Caedric looked at Thomas Holt and saw, in the weathered lines of his face, a reflection of everything he had failed to see from behind the walls of his study. This was his duchy, not the ministers and the nobles and the political operatives who circled his throne like carrion birds. These hands, these faces, these people who had survived his neglect and still came when called because someone else had bothered to care when he had not. "I will not lie to you," Caedric said, loud enough for the entire courtyard to hear. "The men coming to this gate are professionals. They are well armed and well paid, and they have no loyalty to anything except the house that writes their wages. We are outnumbered. We are outfitted with farming tools and hunting bows against trained soldiers, and the man responsible for protecting you for the past decade did not do his job. Silence. The wind cut across the courtyard. Torchlight guttered. But the woman who did do that job is standing on that rampart right now, and she is not leaving. And neither am I. He turned to Drayton. Position the villagers on the inner walls. They know this terrain. They know the ridge lines, the blind spots, the approaches that do not appear on military maps. Use that. Put archers on the east tower, axemen at the gate. And tell every man and woman in this castle that when the sun comes up, they are fighting for the ground under their feet, not for a title. Drayton, who had served 3 Ravenshade rulers and had never heard any of them speak to common people as though their presence mattered, nodded with an expression that was equal parts shock and something he would later, reluctantly, identify as respect. The castle prepared. Caedric found Lucien on the north wall, scanning the tree line with a spyglass. His brother's face was still bruised from the pursuit of Voss, a dark stain spreading across his left cheekbone that made his grin, when it appeared, look crooked and slightly deranged. 43 farmers, Lucien said, against professional mercenaries. You know this is insane. I know this is what we have. Father would have locked the gates and let the countryside burn. Father died alone in a room full of people who were already dividing his estate before his body was cold. I am not interested in replicating his strategy. Lucien lowered the spyglass. He looked at his brother in the gray pre-dawn light, and something passed between them that neither had the vocabulary for, because their father had never taught them the words. It was not a declaration. It was not an embrace. It was the silent acknowledgement of 2 men who had spent 30 years circling each other from opposite sides of the same wound, and had finally, in the hours before a battle neither was certain they would survive, arrived at the same place. If we get through this, Lucien said, you owe me a drink. If we get through this, I owe you considerably more than that. Start with the drink. We can negotiate the rest. Caedric put his hand on Lucien's shoulder, held it there for 2 seconds, then moved to the next defensive position without looking back. The Mortain riders emerged from the tree line at first light. They came in a column formation along the north road, their horses dark against the snow-covered fields, their weapons catching the early sun in flashes of cold steel. Caedric counted them from the gatehouse tower. 46 mounted men. Professional cavalry equipped with carbines, sabers, and the quiet confidence of soldiers who had been paid well enough to kill without hesitation. At their head rode a man in a black coat with the Mortain crest embroidered on his collar. Not a lord, a captain, which meant Mortain had enough political sense to keep titled nobility away from the violence, and enough money to hire someone who specialized in it. The column halted 200 yards from the main gate. The captain rode forward alone. His horse was a tall gray stallion that moved with mechanical precision across the frozen ground. He stopped within shouting distance of the wall and looked up at the gatehouse with the professional detachment of a man assessing a construction project. Duke Ravenshade, his voice carried across the distance without strain. Lord Mortain extends his regards and his regret. He has authorized me to offer terms. Caedric leaned over the rampart. Terms require negotiation. You brought an army. Those are not the tools of a man who intends to negotiate. The terms are simple. Vacate Blackthorn Keep, surrender the Valemere Charter, transfer administrative authority to the Parliamentary Commission that Lord Mortain will chair. In exchange, your family retains its personal property and its lives. And if I decline? The captain shrugged with the economical gesture of a man who had delivered ultimatums before and knew that the conversation rarely mattered. Then I am authorized to resolve the situation by alternative means. We can be inside your walls by noon, Your Grace. The gate is the only question, and gates are temporary problems. Caedric straightened. Below him, on the inner walls and in the courtyard and at every defensive position Drayton had established, 100 people waited. Guards and farmers, soldiers and teachers. The professional machinery of a ducal household fused with the improvised resilience of the communities it had failed, and that had come to its defense anyway. He thought about what it meant to stand on a wall and choose a fight you were not certain you could win, not because the odds were favorable or because victory was assured, but because the alternative, surrender, capitulation, the quiet handing over of everything you had spent your life building and everything you had just begun to understand was worth protecting, was a death more complete than anything a mercenary's saber could deliver. A man does not become dangerous when he has everything. A man becomes dangerous when he has finally found the thing he cannot survive losing, and someone rides up to his gate and demands he hand it over. "Captain," Caedric called down, "tell Lord Mortain that Valemere declines his generous offer, and tell him that the next time he wants to take something from me, he should come himself instead of sending an employee." The captain nodded as though the answer was expected. He turned his horse and rode back to the column. 8 minutes later, they charged. The first assault hit the main gate like a battering ram made of horseflesh and steel. Riders peeled off the column in waves, carbine fire cracking against the stone walls and sending chips of granite flying across the ramparts. Caedric's guards returned fire from the tower positions. The sound was enormous, a roaring collision of gunpowder and screaming horses, and shouted commands that turned the frozen morning into a landscape of organized violence. The gate held. Drayton had reinforced it with timber beams braced against the courtyard floor, and the first wave broke against it like water against a seawall, riders pulling back in disorder as the defenders poured fire down from the walls. 3 mercenaries fell in the first exchange. 2 horses went down screaming. The column regrouped at distance and the captain reassessed. The second assault came at the east wall, where the defenses were thinner and the stone was older. A detachment of 12 riders dismounted and advanced on foot, using the terrain for cover, working their way toward a section of wall where decades of frost damage had created handholds in the crumbling mortar. They met the villagers from Thornbrook, 11 men and 3 women who knew every crack in that wall because they had walked past it for generations on their way to the market road. They met the climbing mercenaries with axes and stones and a fury that professional soldiers do not train for because it cannot be purchased or replicated. It is the fury of people defending their own ground, and it is older than warfare and more ferocious than anything discipline can produce. 4 mercenaries went down on the east wall. The rest retreated. Caedric moved between positions with Drayton at his side, directing fire, plugging gaps, deploying reserves where the pressure was greatest. He fought the way he governed, with precision, with economy, without wasted motion. But there was something different in his movement now, something the guards noticed and the villagers felt even if they could not name it. He was not commanding from above. He was fighting beside them, shoulder to shoulder on the ramparts, taking the same risks, drawing the same fire. And when a carbine round struck the stonework 6 inches from his head and sprayed his face with fragments, he did not flinch. He wiped the blood from his eye and kept moving. The third assault was the worst. The captain committed his full force against the main gate, 20 riders in a concentrated charge, supported by dismounted shooters providing covering fire from the tree line. The gate timbers cracked under the impact. The bracing shifted. Caedric felt the vibration through the stone beneath his boots and knew, with the tactical clarity that had kept him alive for a decade, that the gate would not survive a 4th charge. He descended to the courtyard. Seraphina was there. She had not retreated to the interior of the castle. She had spent the battle organizing supply lines, treating wounded, directing the movement of ammunition and water to the defensive positions with the efficiency of someone who understood logistics at a structural level. Her gray dress was stained with soot and blood that was not hers. Her hair had come loose from its pins. She looked nothing like the woman who had walked through the cathedral in silver embroidery 7 weeks ago, and everything like the woman who had rebuilt 7 villages while her husband pretended she did not exist. "The gate is failing," Caedric said. "I know. If they breach the courtyard, get to the north tunnel. It exits beyond the cliff face. Lucian knows the route. I am not leaving." "Seraphina, I am not leaving, Caedric. We discussed this." He looked at her, blood on his face, sweat soaking through his coat, the cacophony of battle hammering the walls around them. And in that look was everything he had spent 10 years refusing to feel and 7 weeks refusing to see, and the past 24 hours learning, at catastrophic speed, to accept. She was the answer to a question he had not known he was asking. And the question was not, how do I keep power? The question was, what is power for? "Then stand with me," he said. She took her place at his side. Caedric drew his sword. It was his father's blade, the notched weapon from the armory wall, and he held it with the grip of a man who understood that the instrument had never been used for anything worth fighting for until this moment. The gate gave way on the fourth charge. Timbers splintered inward. Riders poured through the breach in a flood of horses and steel and deafening noise. The courtyard erupted. Guards met the charge with bayonets and sabers. Villagers swung axes at horses' legs and pulled riders from their saddles with bare hands. The fighting was close and savage and devoid of the strategic elegance that military historians would later impose upon it. Caedric fought in the center of the line. He killed the first mercenary who reached him with a thrust that took the man through the gap in his riding coat. He turned and caught a saber strike on his own blade, the impact jarring through his wrist and shoulder, and drove the attacker back with a combination that owed nothing to fencing technique and everything to the raw, desperate energy of a man fighting on his own ground for his own people for the first time in his life. Lucien appeared on his left, bleeding from a cut above his ear, laughing the unhinged laugh of a man who had found, in the middle of chaos, something that felt more honest than any ballroom or political salon he had ever occupied. "Still alive!" Lucien shouted. "Barely! Barely count!" The mercenary captain broke through the line with 4 riders and drove toward the great hall entrance where Seraphina stood directing the flow of wounded into the interior. Caedric saw it. The trajectory. The intention. The captain was not trying to take the castle. He was trying to take a hostage. Caedric moved with speed he did not know he possessed. He crossed 12 feet of courtyard in a straight line, vaulted over a fallen horse, and met the captain's charge at the base of the great hall steps. The captain's saber came down in an arc aimed at his skull. Caedric caught it on his father's blade, twisted, and drove the pommel into the captain's jaw. The man fell sideways from his saddle. Caedric followed him down to the cobblestones and put the sword's edge against his throat. "Yield," Caedric said, "or die in someone else's courtyard for someone else's ambition." The captain looked up at the Duke of Valemere, blood in his mouth, his jaw broken, his professional detachment replaced by the animal recognition that the man above him was not bluffing and was not negotiating and was operating from a place that mercenary training did not account for. "I yield," the captain said. Caedric stood. He looked across the courtyard at the remaining mercenaries, who had watched their commander fall and were now processing the tactical implications of a headless assault force trapped inside a defensive position with no line of retreat. "Your captain has yielded," Caedric shouted, his voice cut through the noise like a blade through fabric. "Any man who drops his weapon now walks out of this castle alive. Any man who does not will be buried in it." The fighting stopped in stages. Steel clattered against cobblestones. Horses were brought under control. Wounded men groaned in the sudden, deafening quiet that follows violence the way silence follows thunder. 17 mercenaries surrendered. 11 were dead. The rest had fled through the broken gate and were already being pursued by Drayton's riders along the north road. Of Caedric's defenders, 9 were wounded seriously. 3 were dead. 2 guards and Thomas Holt from Briarfield, who had taken a saber cut defending the east wall and had died holding the axe his father had given him 30 years earlier. Caedric stood over Thomas Holt's body in the courtyard as the sun cleared the eastern cliffs and poured light across the blood-stained cobblestones. The woodcutter from Briarfield lay on his back with his eyes open and his axe still in his grip and an expression on his face that was not pain, but something closer to satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who had died doing something that mattered for people who would remember why. Seraphina knelt beside the body. She did not cry. She placed her hand on Thomas Holt's chest and stayed there for a long time, while the morning light moved across the courtyard and the castle settled into the exhausted stillness that follows survival. Caedric watched her and understood, with a finality that had nothing to do with politics or strategy, what power actually cost when it was exercised in service of something real. The price was not abstract. It was a man with a woodcutter's axe and a wife who wrote letters, and a youngest child who was alive because a duchess had sent grain in the winter. He knelt beside Seraphina, beside the man who had come to defend his home and paid the price for it. And the Duke of Valemere, who had never bent his knee for anyone or anything in his adult life, knelt on the cold stones of his own courtyard and felt the weight of that cost settle into his bones where it would remain permanently. The aftermath unfolded over weeks. Pemberton's confession, combined with Voss's capture and the physical evidence of Mortaine's armed assault on a ducal seat, created a political earthquake that shook the parliamentary system to its foundations. The Mortaine petition was not merely defeated, it was inverted. Parliament opened a formal investigation into House Mortain for conspiracy, sabotage, and the unauthorized use of military force against a sovereign duchy. Lord Mortaine himself was summoned before a tribunal. His assets were frozen. His alliances dissolved overnight, as the same nobles who had supported his petition scrambled to distance themselves from a house that had crossed the line from political maneuvering into open warfare. Caedric traveled to the capital to present the evidence personally. He stood before Parliament in the same chamber where his father and grandfather had stood before him. And he did something that no Ravenshade had ever done in 3 centuries of political dominance. He told the truth. Not the curated, strategically useful version of truth that politicians trade like currency. The actual truth. That his administration had failed, that his ministers had been corrupt, that his duchy had been starving while he fought political battles in gilded rooms, and that the person who had identified the failure and begun correcting it was not the Duke of Valemere, but the woman he married for her money and spent 6 weeks refusing to acknowledge. Parliament listened in stunned silence. When he finished, the Speaker of the Chamber asked a single question. And what assurance can the Duke of Valemere offer that these failures will not be repeated? Caedric looked at Seraphina, who was seated in the gallery above. She held his gaze without expression, without prompting, without any signal that told him what to say. None, Caedric said. I can offer no assurance. I can only offer the fact that the person most capable of holding me accountable is now standing beside me rather than being excluded from the process. That is not a guarantee. It is a structural change, and structural changes are the only kind that survive the people who implement them. The charter was upheld, unanimously. Spring came to Valemere the way it always came, slowly, reluctantly. Ice retreating from the cliffs in stages, mud replacing snow in the roads, the first green shoots appearing in fields that had lain fallow through the worst winter in memory. Caedric oversaw the reconstruction himself, not from his study, from the ground. He rode to every village Seraphina had supplied and met every family she had fed and listened to every grievance that his ministers had been burying for years. He did not enjoy it. He was not built for warmth or small talk or the patient, repetitive work of earning trust from people who had spent a decade learning to fear him. But he did it because the alternative was retreating behind his walls and becoming his father, and that was a death he was no longer willing to die. Seraphina rode with him, not as a symbol, as a partner. She had the relationships he lacked and the local knowledge his maps could not provide. Together they rebuilt what had been broken. Schools, supply routes, agricultural infrastructure, a network of village councils that gave the Eastern Corridor a voice in ducal governance for the first time in Valemere's history. Lucien stayed through the spring. He served as Caedric's liaison to Parliament, leveraging the charm and political fluency that had always been his greatest asset and deploying it for the first time in service of something larger than his own comfort. He and Caedric did not become close in the way that stories typically demand of brothers who have survived a crisis together. They did not embrace on hillsides or share tearful confessions by firelight. What they became was honest. They argued in council meetings. They disagreed about policy. They frustrated each other with the specific targeted efficiency that only siblings can achieve. But underneath the friction was a foundation that had not existed before. A foundation built not on blood or obligation, but on the shared experience of having stood on the same wall and fought for the same thing and survived to argue about it afterward. On a warm evening in late April, Caedric returned to Blackthorn Keep from a 3-day ride through the northern villages. He was tired. His coat was dusty. His horse was lathered. The castle looked different in the spring light. The same black stone and iron banners, but the courtyards were open now. Servants moved freely. Voices carried from the kitchen gardens where Seraphina had expanded her lavender beds into a full working herb garden that supplied both the castle and the village apothecaries. He dismounted in the courtyard and handed his reins to a groom, walked through the main hall where the scars from the battle were still visible in the stonework, climbed the stairway to the west wing. He knocked on Seraphina's door. She opened it. She was wearing a simple linen dress, and her hair was down, and there was ink on her fingers from the correspondence she had been managing. Letters from village councils, trade proposals, agricultural reports, the work of a duchy that was being rebuilt one document at a time. How were the northern villages? She asked. Recovering? The new grain stores are holding. Drayton's garrison has established a permanent post at the Thornbrook crossroads. He paused. Marin Holt asked me to give you this. He held out a folded piece of paper. Seraphina took it and opened it. Inside was a child's drawing, a house with smoke coming from the chimney, a garden with flowers, and beside the house, drawn in the unsteady hand of a child not yet old enough to hold a pencil properly, a figure in a gray dress with silver lines radiating from her like moonlight. The Silver Lady. Seraphina looked at the drawing for a long time. Her expression did not change, but her breathing did. A single sharp intake that she released slowly through slightly parted lips. The breath of a woman who had spent years building walls of her own and was learning, as slowly and reluctantly as the spring itself, to let them come down. Come inside, she said. Caedric stepped through the door, the same door he had crossed for the first time on the night before the battle, when he had asked her to tell him whether anything in him was worth saving. The room was different now, warmer, lived in. The writing desk was covered in papers, and the bookshelves were full, and a vase of fresh lavender stood on the windowsill where she had once pressed her fingers against cold glass and stared at the frozen sea. He sat in the chair by the fire. She sat across from him. The evening light came through the window in long amber bars that fell across the floor between them. Outside, the sound of the castle settling into its evening rhythms. Footsteps. Doors closing. The distant clatter of the kitchen preparing dinner. The ordinary music of a household that was learning to function without fear as its organizing principle. I need to tell you something, Caedric said. Tell me. I spent 10 years believing that the strongest thing a man could be was alone, that needing someone was a structural flaw, that the person who stands apart from everyone else stands above them. He looked at his hands. The cut on his palm from the night he gripped the whiskey glass had healed into a thin white scar. I was not strong. I was fortified. And there is a difference that I did not understand until you showed me what it looked like when someone is actually strong enough to walk into a broken place and fix it without needing anyone to notice. Seraphina set the child's drawing on the table beside her chair. I did not fix it alone. No, but you started alone, and starting alone is the hardest part. The fire cracked softly. The light shifted. Somewhere in the castle, Lucien's laughter rang out from the dining hall below, warm and irreverent and completely inappropriate for the hour, and for the first time the sound did not produce tension in Caedric's jaw. It produced something else, something he did not have a name for yet, but was learning to recognize by the way it loosened the muscles across his shoulders and allowed him to breathe at a depth he had been avoiding for years. I do not know how to be the man this duchy needs, Caedric said. The man my father trained me to be cannot do it, and the man I am becoming does not have enough practice to be trusted with it yet. Then practice, Seraphina said. That is all any of us are doing. He looked at her across the firelight. The woman who had arrived at his cathedral in rain-soaked silver and walked the aisle alone and signed a contract that bound her to a man who could not be bothered to look at her. The woman who had mapped his failures from a library window and fed his people from her own pocket and stood in his courtyard during a battle she had no obligation to fight. The woman who had dismantled a conspiracy with a pen and a confession and the precise, devastating application of mercy at the moment when mercy was the last thing anyone expected. She had not saved him. That was the wrong word and it carried the wrong implication. She had shown him that saving himself required becoming someone capable of being saved. And the distance between those two things was the distance he had traveled in 7 weeks, from the altar where he refused to look at her to this chair where he could not look away. Seraphina. Yes. Thank you for staying. She held his gaze. The amber light played across her face, the ink on her fingers, the strand of hair falling across her cheekbone, the calm, unguarded expression of a woman who had spent a lifetime building defenses and had finally found a place where she did not need all of them. Thank you for asking. The fire burned low. The castle settled. Night came to Valemere the way night comes to places that have survived what they were not supposed to survive, slowly, gently, and with the particular quality of darkness that exists only in the absence of threat. Not emptiness, peace, the kind that is not given but earned, and not earned once but earned daily, in the small repetitive acts of showing up and staying present and doing the work of being human in a world that rewards the opposite. Years later, the stories about the Duke of Valemere diverged in the way that stories always diverge when the truth is more complicated than the legend. In the capital, they told the story of the siege, the Duke who held his castle against mercenaries with farmers and hunting bows. The parliamentary triumph that destroyed House Mortain, the political resurrection that transformed Valemere from a failing duchy into a model of reformed governance. They told it as a story about power. In the villages, they told a different story. The story of the Silver Lady, who came with grain and blankets when the snow was deepest. The Duchess who knew every family by name and remembered which children were sick and which fields needed drainage and which roads washed out in the spring rains. They told it as a story about care. But inside Blackthorn Keep, in the corridors and the kitchens and the gardens where the people who lived with the Duke and Duchess every day observed them at close range, the story they told was simpler and more difficult than either version. They told the story of a man who paused outside his wife's door every evening, who stood there for a moment with his hand not yet raised to knock, his face losing the severity it wore in council chambers and on battlefields, his shoulders dropping from the rigid posture of command into something that looked in the forgiving light of the corridor lamps like relief. As though the door itself was a border crossing between the man the world required him to be and the man he had chosen to become. And the pause was the moment of transition, the shedding of armor, the acceptance that strength and softness could coexist in the same body without one destroying the other. And then he would knock, and she would open the door, and the most feared duke in the kingdom would step inside, and the door would close, and the corridor would return to silence. That was the story worth telling, not because it was dramatic or triumphant or larger than life, but because it was true. And truth, unlike power, does not need to be defended. It only needs to be lived.